Bonjour à tous. You know, I'll be honest, that's probably about all the French I speak. And it's because, really, I learnt French at school, as we do. But I had a bit of an embarrassing experience a few years later. I was on holiday, and I saw someone who was clearly French, and I thought, here we go, I can practice. So I went up to them, and I said, Bonjour, je m'appelle Jackie. And he said, hello. And we got into conversation, and he said, où habites-tu, Jackie? And I said, à l'Angleterre. He said, tu parles français? And I said, oui, un petit pois. And he laughed. And I cringed. Because I realized immediately, I said peas! And so I kind of stopped trying after that moment, that embarrassment. I think we can draw a lot of parallels between that little story and the subject of diversity and inclusion. One, the impact of our language is phenomenal. And especially in the speaking community, we should be mindful of that. And the second thing is that sometimes when we fail to truly understand, we make mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes cause us to stop trying. And I've been reading this book, you might have heard of it, called Becoming. It's quite famous at the moment, Michelle Obama's book. And in it, almost her first chapter says, you know, we all have our story. It's the only thing that makes us unique, truly. And we must own it. You see, when I was around 4 or 5 years of age, my left eye turned inwards. And so I looked a bit different to the other kids that I used to play with in my street. And at that same time, at 5 years old, I was heading off to school. But you know, just because my parents had different religious beliefs to the other parents of the kids in the street, I was going off to a different school. Now, perhaps as adults, we might say, that's okay. It doesn't matter. We embrace difference. But when you're 5, it hurts. I was shouted at, these names called at me down the street. Previous friends of mine stopped knocking on the door to see if I would come out to play. It's a really isolating place to feel excluded. And years later, I wondered which parent or teacher or caregiver taught my now 15-year-old classmates terms like leather, dyke. But you see, these were labels that I was given simply because of some of my differences. Turns out, I wasn't like the other girls in my class, and I didn't like boys that way. Now, as adults, we might say, it doesn't matter. We embrace difference. But when you're 15, it hurts. It doesn't have to be about the color of your skin. It doesn't have to be about your race. It doesn't have to be about your gender or your disability. It could be about just the way in which we process, the way in which we storytell, the way in which we think. But how do we embrace them? When people say to me, well, how can I be more inclusive? I say to them, well, firstly, let's stop the isolation. You see, I heard a quote some years back that simplified and demystified diversity and inclusion for me. It simply says, diversity is inviting different people to your party. But inclusion is teaching those people to dance together. I wonder what more we could do. And when people say to me, how can I be more inclusive? I say, Well, let's stop the hurt. Let's be mindful of the language that we use. Well, let's get rid of the negative labels. Labels that just serve to isolate, segregate, and divide us. I wonder when you last used a label that was unkind. One of my comedy heroes is the late, great Victoria Wood. And she was discussing in one of her famous Dinner Ladies sketches, if anybody's watched it, how she makes her life more interesting. And she says, in her very northern accent, "I'll tell you what I do. I take the labels off my tins, so I don't know what I'm having for me tea." Now, I think that is a wonderful example of inclusion, don't you? I wonder how much more interesting your lives would be if even just for one day you could take the labels off your tins. That's how I try to demystify diversity and inclusion. Just in a world, as they say, where you can be anything, be kind. Your differences may not be the same as my differences, but it is our uniqueness that creates something wonderful in the world. And you know, there's a dramatic speaker bit coming up, just letting you know. Because as we all know, the journey to diversity and inclusion, just like any journey, begins with just one step. Are you ready? Will you come with me? Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
It was a pleasure to listen to Jackie. That was so authentic.
Jackie is such an inspirational speaker when it comes to understanding how to create a greater sense of inclusion and really respecting diversity. She is just a joy to behold. She is so human, and I encourage you to book her.
I just listened to Jackie a few hours ago, and I was touched by her story, because what she is her story. She talks about, all the way from her upbringing up until now in a lovely way. I was touched, I was moved, and that's what I want from a great speaker.